this, and I am going to share a text which I will use for this purpose. Here we go. So I will divide this largely into two parts, and my thoughts are about the concept of Rosh Hashanah, where its identity comes from, and in fact, how it calls to us in terms of Jewish identity. The reference to what we call Rosh Hashanah appears twice in the Torah, as you'll see here. That in Vayikra, in the long section in Emor, which discusses the festivals, we have Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe le'emor, Daber b'nei Yisrael le'emor, speak to the Bnei Yisrael as follows: B'chodesh hashavi'i b'echad lachodesh, in the 7th month of the first of the month, yeh lochem shabboson. It shall be a shabboson, a festival for you. Zichron troi mikra kodesh. It will be a holy festival, a zichron teruah, which means a commemoration of the shofar, of the blowing. You shall do no servile work. Vikrav 10 isher la'Hashem, and you shall bring offerings to God. That's reference 1. Reference 2, Ubachodesh Hashadi'i. This is in the section in Pinchas near the end of the Midbar. This is where the maftir offerings are listed. These are the sections we read as maftir on each of the days of Yom Tov. Ubachodesh Hashadi'i bechod lachodesh. In the 7th month on the 1st of the month, Mikra Kodesh Yalochem. It shall be a holy festival for you. Kol melechas avodah lo sasu. You shall do no forbidden work. Yom Teruah Yalochem. It shall be a Yom Teruah, a day of blowing for you. And that's it. There's a little more there about the offerings that we brought. I'm going to put you on mute.
Our subject is to...
Right. Now, that's it. There are no references in the Torah to the name Rosh Hashanah, to what we call Rosh Hashanah. And in fact, there's a little more in the second paragraph. It's about offerings. There are no other references in the early brief references in Shemos to the festival. There's no reference to Rosh Hashanah, and in the longer repetition in Devorim in Parshas Re'eh, there is no reference there, because there it only talks about festivals that will be observed differently in the land, and Rosh Hashanah is not one of the pilgrim festivals. So that is it. So when I call it the missing festival, we know it's on the 1st of the month, the 7th month. It says that here, and it says it here too. But we don't know anything else about it other than today here called Zichron Teruah, of remembrance of the blowing, and here of Yom Teruah blowing, which may be similar things. And that's it. So we have to kind of, how do we get from these verses to what we call Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of the year? After all, this is in the 7th month, and there's a lengthy discussion in the tractate Rosh Hashanah about this issue, about how to date years, which we don't have time for. And also, how do we get to a festival which is a celebration of the sovereignty of God, new beginnings, which seems to have a very distinct and very specific character? Where does it come from? It does not appear ostensibly in the Torah. That's why I'm calling it the missing festival, Rosh Hashanah in the Torah. So here, we need to go to the Mishnah. The first Mishnah in the tractate Rosh Hashanah, Arba Rosh Hashanim Haim. There are 4 Rosh Hashanahs. That means there are 4 New Years. And they're mostly, actually, these New Years, end and beginning of tithing seasons. Given that the Torah requires one to tithe the produce of one year altogether, we need to know when the year ends and the new year begins. But there are 4 New Years, and I missed out some of them. But Erchel B'Tishri, the 1st of Tishri, which we know as the 7th month. Tishri is clearly a later name. It's drawn from the Babylonian period. The Torah just calls it the 7th month, 7th month, 7th month. And here we call it Rosh Hashanah. That's the first occurrence. Is Rosh Hashanah Lashonim? It's the new year for years. That means the year number changes. L'shmitin, liovlos, and Natia, liorokos. For Shmita years, that's the 7th year. For the counting of the Jubilee years, that's the every 50th year. And for the tithing of plantings and vegetables, where the tithings of fruits are counted differently. So here we see this is the first occasion, and a little further on, I'm just going to move a little further on, we have a lot more to say about this. But this is all we get. In terms of the basic sources, we see that there's a seventh month, the first day, in these sources here, the seventh month, the first day. And then this seventh month, which is now by the time of the Mishnah, around the year 200 is written, is now known as Rosh HaShanah. This is the year. This is the beginning of the year. And then the Mishnah says, all those who walk the earth come before God like sheep, we pass before God. But the question is, where does all this come from? There appears to be no trace of this in the Torah itself. According to the Torah, it will be a day when there's no malacha, there's no forbidden activity, and you'd blow a horn in some way. That's it. No celebration of God's sovereignty, ostensibly, and none of the familiar ideas, not even the familiar name. So that's the starting point. Now, a deeper look at this requires us to go the liturgy and then perhaps backwards a little. So the Mishnah, I hear it's gone wrong here. No, it's not gone wrong, I'm sorry. Here we have the Mishnah at the end of the fourth tractate. For those who are learning tractate Rosh Hashanah with me, it's a bit disappointing that it takes so long for the Mishnah, for the Rosh Hashanah to actually talk about what we know as Rosh Hashanah, blowing the shofar, the special Musaf service, and so on. Here we have Seder Brochos, the order of the blessings. Now, just about as background, as I'm sure you are aware, the weekday Amida has 19 brachas. The Shabbos Amida and the regular Yom Tov Amidas have 7. 3 at the beginning, which are praising God, 3 at the end of the thanking God, and 1 in the middle called Kedushas Hayom, which talks about the themes of the day. Which Shabbos and Yom Tov obviously are different. Now, Rosh Hashanah is completely different. Rosh Hashanah uniquely, Yom Kippur follows the same pattern, 7 brachas, but Rosh Hashanah, at Musaf, we have a 9 bracha Amida. We have 3 brachas at the beginning and 3 at the end, which are the standard, 3 praise, 3 thanks. And then we have 3 brachas in the middle, and the Rosh Hashanah Musaf is the longest prayer of the year. Now, let's have a look at where this comes from. We begin to kind of piece things together. So says the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah, Seder brachos, here's the order of the brachos. Omer Oves Ugevures Kudush Hashem. We'll lump those together. That's the first 3 brachos. V'cholel Malchus Imohen. And when you're talking about the sanctity of the divine name, the third bracha, you include references to God's sovereignty there. Ve'ein tokea, no blowing. Kudush Hayom v'Sokea. Then you mention the sanctity of the day, talk about the themes of Rosh Hashanah, and you blow. Zichronos Tokea. Then you mention remembrances, and then you blow. Shofars, verses about the role of his shofar in history, v'Sokea, and you blow. V'Oma avoda v'Hidor u'Berachos Kahanim. And then you say the final 3 brachas, which are Ritzei, Modim, and Simsholah, which are known here. These are the 3 brachas of praise. Divrei Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Now, this is not familiar. This is not what we do. Omenu Rabbi Akiva says to him, in Eino Tokela Malchius, if you do not blow when you pronounce the verses of God's kingship, Lamahu Mazkir, what's the point of the exercise? So what the Mishnah here is doing is associating blowing the shofar with proclaiming God's sovereign, as it were, coronation ceremony. Ella, what should you do? And what Rabbi Akiva describes is what we do. We say the first 3 brachas, as usual, although there are, of course, additions for this season. Malchius in Kedushas Hayom. Then we say a bracha which refers to the sanctity of the day, and we package together verses about God's sovereignty. For Sokeh, we blow the shofar. Zichronos, remembrances and blow. Shofars for Sokeh, the shofar and blow. That's what we do. We have those 3 brachas now. In Sephardi communities and in Hasidic communities have adopted that practice. They blow the shofar in the private Amida after the brachas. In our shuls, we don't do that. We only do this, as stated here, during the Chazan's repetition of the Amida. V'Oma avoda v'Hodor Birkas Kahanim. And then one says, Avodah, Hodor, and Birkas Kahanim, which are the last 3 brachas. So this mission has taught us some interesting things. Let's disregard the pattern of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri because we're not going to follow it. The Amida we have is the Amida of Rabbi Akiva. So it makes 2 points. First of all, if you don't blow the shofar when proclaiming God's sovereignty, i.e. once you've said the verses of sovereignty, God's kingship, there's no purpose. Why would you say them, as the translation here says? Rather, you say the first three brachas, and then the theme of the day and God's sovereignty are intimately tied up. They are one and the same. And then you blow the shofar, and then you do the other two. Got remembrance and shofar, and after each of those, you say, after that, you blow the shofar. So, a little more about this. This is it's the next Mishnah. Ein pochasim, so the way it's worked out is the translation's on the next page, but there's not much I can do about that. Ein pochasim me'asora malchius, me'asora zichronos, me'asora shoforis. You should say no fewer than 10 verses about God's sovereignty, 10 verses about God's remembering us, and 10 verses about the role of the shofar. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Omer, im Omer shalosh shalosh mikulon yotza. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says if you say just 3, you discharge your mitzvah. The Aisha dates you should say ideally 10, but if you say 3, you can do it. Bearing in mind this is written before printed books, where there was probably a more freestyle approach to this, and people selected their own biblical verses about these things. And there are some more guidelines here. Eimas kirin zichro malchus shofar shel puronos. You should not choose verses for any of these 3 themes, which are about punishment. They should be positive. Okay, that's enough of this. So the Mishnah is starting from with a great assumption that God's sovereignty is essential to the theme of the day. We've not seen any trace of that in the Torah text. And that there are 3 specific themes: the primary theme of God's sovereignty and the secondary themes of God's remembrances and shofar. Now, let's move on to the next page. And so the top bit is the translation that got left behind. So here really is a key source. This is a Gemara in Rosh HaShanah. And this Gemara is really asking about the themes of the various festivals. And this is going to be where we can begin to read between the lines. Tanya, we were taught in a brisa. Now, the way this translation is the Steinsaltz translation, which is available online. The dark text is actually the translation of the text, and the thinner text is the interpolation for explanatory purposes. Tanya, Omer Rebbe Yehuda Mishum Rebbe Akiva. Rebbe Yehuda said in the name of Rebbe Akiva, Mipnei ma Omer Torah heviu Omer b'Pesach. Why did the Torah say, bring the Omer offering, that's the barley grain offering brought on the second day of Pesach? Why? Mipnei shah Pesach zaman tuvuahu. Because Pesach is a time of grain. So therefore, God says, Hevi'u lefonai omer b'Pesach. Bring the omer before me on Pesach. That's not what we call counting the omer. This is the grain offering, barley on the second day of Pesach. Why so? So that your grain in the fields will be blessed. Why did the Torah say bring these 2 special loaves on Shavuos? Because that time of the year, Shavuos is when the trees are growing their fruit. God says, bring before me 2 loaves which represent the grain and the produce, and if you like, and the success and plenty, but it says on Shavuos, in order that the fruits of the tree should be blessed for you. We're getting there. I'm sorry, we're near the end. Why does the Torah say, bring a water libation on Sukkot, on the HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Because God says, bring before me a water offering on Sukkot, so that the waters of the year will be blessed for you. Then, okay. And say, before me on Rosh HaShanah, Malchius, Zichronos, Shofars, kingships, remembrances, and verses about the shofar. Why? Malchius kedei shetam lihuni aleichem. Verses of kingship, so you should proclaim me king over you. Zichronos, verses of remembrance, kedei sheyale zichronechem lefonai latova. Verses of remembrance, in order that your remembrance should come before me favorably. And how? And what is the medium of achieving these two things? Bashofar, with a shofar. So what is interesting about this source is the one about Rosh Hashanah does not follow the formula of the previous three, but it does effectively say the Torah is requiring us to do certain things. It is requiring us to proclaim God King, but it doesn't ask the question, what is the textual basis? And there's a lot of kind of consideration as to how this might work, but I think it works like this, and one needs to read between the lines. What I didn't show you, perhaps it was slightly naughty, I didn't show you that in the original verse in Vayikra, which is the first source on the first sheet, I didn't show you the context. There's a well-known anomaly that in the passage dealing with the festivals, it starts with Shabbos and then Pesach and then the Omer offering and then Shavuos, as you'd expect. And what do you now expect after Shavuos? We're to go direct to Rosh Hashanah because that's the next thing in line. But there's one line that gets in the way. There is a line in between describing what happens on Shavuos and what happens on what we call Rosh Hashanah. And here it is. And when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not finish off the corner of your field in your reaping. And the gleanings of your harvest you shall not take. Why? You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. Ani Hashem Elokeichem, I am the Lord your God. This verse lies between the record of Shavuos and the verse that I showed you on the other page here, which is the verse about Rosh Hashanah. It's the verse that it's immediately before this. Now, almost all sources deal with this anomaly, but the anomaly is as follows. It is that this verse, which deals with gleanings and leaving the corners of the field, has already appeared. First, we've got this mitzvah somewhere else. It's appeared a couple of parshias. Before this, we don't need it. So it's redundant. And secondly, it's completely out of place. There's an entire, a column and a half or so dealing with the festivals, all about the festivals, with the exception of this one line. And almost all the sources that discuss it make the following assumption. Shavuos is a time of plenty. It's a time of harvest. It's a time when people perhaps are hoarding things and might instead need to be advised to be generous with the poor, with those who are disenfranchised. Here it's explicitly the poor and the ger. These are people who perhaps haven't got land of their own and need to be supported by your success and bounty. Now, as I said, almost all sources try to make a connection. Shavuot somehow segues into this verse, but I think there's another way to understand it. It's not about Shavuot segueing into this verse. It's about this verse segueing into Rosh Hashanah, into what happens, as it says, on the first of the seventh month, which is Zichron Teruah, the time when we recall the shofar. Now, if you think about it carefully, there is a thematic link. First of all, Ani Hashem Elokeichem, I am the Lord your God, goes directly into the instruction to observe a festival on the first of the seventh month and to blow the shofar. But there's more. That's not adequate because there are many places in the Torah where it talks about I am the Lord your God. The theme here is really fascinating. Leaving the corners of the field and leaving gleaning is effectively saying that although I have grown the field, although I have put in all this effort to make the crops grow, and ostensibly I've fought off the enemies and the pests and the nuisances, and I've combated the weather, and finally the crops have all grown, well, it's all mine, isn't it? So the Torah says it doesn't work like that. When you, and the emphasis here is, and when you reap the harvest of your land, all your stuff with your, it's all yours, you believe it's yours, then you have to stop and you have to leave the corner of the field. You have to leave the corner behind. You have to leave what falls, the gleanings, or what falls when you pick and some just drops on the ground, and you just leave that for the poor and for the stranger. This mitzvah, in some ways, is critical to a sense of the farmer's context, contextualizing himself, herself, and recognizing that God runs the show. Because ultimately, by following an instruction that one is to leave part of it, you are effectively acknowledging that it belongs to God, and God can decide how to allocate it. He's doing most of it. But part of it, the corn of the field, the things the gleanings that drop as you're harvesting, you have to leave those to the poor. But God can surely only say that to the farmer if God, in fact, is the owner. And by following this instruction, one is effectively saying, I acknowledge that God actually owns all this, that I'm a tenant. I'm a leaseholder rather than a freeholder. I am, if you like, beholden to God. I need to acknowledge God's largesse. It really all belongs to him, and it's very kind that he lets me have the vast majority of it. Only by ceding part of it and following this instruction does one recognize, I am the Lord your God. Effectively, what one is doing is recognizing through one's deeds here that God runs the show, that God is sovereign, that God is, if you like, the Baal is the owner of what follows. And it's very interesting that we have a tradition, and it's really a little bit of a different subject, but that Rosh HaShanah is the anniversary of the beginning of human history. That's a shir which I'm going to give on Rosh HaShanah, or possibly on Shabbos Shuvah, that this is the beginning of human history. And Rosh Hashanah is a replay, the first of Tishri, the first of the years. When the year changes, it's the anniversary of human beings, when Adam and Eve are first in the garden. Adam and Eve are given a garden. They're given an enormous, if you like, an enormous wealth of opportunities, but they have one rule. And the rule is you're not allowed to eat from a particular tree. And of course, if you had a palace with 500 rooms and 499 were accessible, one was locked, you could just enjoy the 499. But if you did that, it would require to acknowledge that you didn't own the palace. It would require to acknowledge that ultimately God is in control, the king is in control, and the king can regulate which rooms you can use. And his largesse is that you can use all but one. And many people would be extremely frustrated, and it would spoil the enjoyment of all the other rooms by knowing they were not able to access the other room, and they would feel a need to, as it were, to possibly sacrifice everything to have access. This is human nature, the ability to be in control, the need to control, and the willingness to even spoil one's own experience in order to gain control, to come in conflict with the forces, in this case, that brought the world into being. There is a correlation between the mitzvah of payah and what happens in the Garden of Eden. Each will require human beings to acknowledge the presence of God by using most of what's available, but giving up a little, And here you see, therefore, that Adam's task in the Garden of Eden is to acknowledge God as king. He fails to do so because he's unwilling to submit to God's will, not to eat from one of the many, many trees. And he fails in his responsibility to recognize God as king, and history then begins. On Rosh Hashanah, or the day that is now in the Torah, the first of the 7th month, that's juxtaposed to this verse. This verse is about acknowledging that God controls the resources of the world, may allocate them to whomever he wishes, and requires us to act as his agent in taking most of what we grow, but leaving some for the poor, and thereby, as it were, acknowledging him as sovereign. And now you can see where this is going. But first of all, the purpose of this verse is a contextual. Why is it here rather than anywhere else? Well, it's an introduction, conceptual introduction to what follows. But more than that, what the rabbis are doing in this source above is where do we get the idea from that this day is about proclaiming God King, acknowledging God King, expecting a favorable remembrance? Well, we get it from the juxtaposition of this verse 22, with the verses 23 and 24 that follow, that the day that we now call Rosh Hashanah is identified by a very careful reading of the text as a moment in which one can to achieve the primary objective of humanity, which is to recognize God's presence in the world by attributing the resources to his ownership. So that is where I believe the themes come from, that a very careful, very sensitive reading of the text produces a sense that these verses are about sovereignty, about acknowledging sovereignty. First is through a practical act by a farmer, and the second is through a more conceptual act. So we see here that the act of proclaiming God king is performed through the shofar by the juxtaposition of these two verses, which justifies the structures that we have seen till now. So if I move on, we have just a little bit more about this. Validating what I've said, I'm going a little more quickly now. Minayin she'omrin malchus, how do you know, another Gemara much later in the tract of HaShanah, very near the end, how do you know that one is supposed to say verses of sovereignty? Tanya, Rebbe, Omer, Ani Hashem Elokechem, says Rebbe, the author of the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Anossi, I am the Lord your God. That was verse 22. U'bacholish hashavi'i, and in the 7th month, that's verse 23, Zo Malchus. This is proclaiming God's kingship. It's not just because these words, I am the Lord your God, which appear many times in the Torah. It's because they appear in the context of acknowledging God through action in the mitzvah of leaving things for the poor. And as such, we move very smoothly between two areas proclaiming God king, which means this is in fact Gemara in a very compact sense saying, well, I just said it in a rather lengthy way. So the idea that there is some inherent kingship sovereignty theme is borne out by a law that I'm sure you know, which comes from Gemara in Brochas, Va'omer Rabba Baruchinen Asab Mishmei Rav, Kol HaShanah Kula Adam Mispalel HaKehel HaKodesh. All through the year, the third bracha of the Amidah should end the holy God, which is I'm sure familiar, and we end another bracha in the weekday Amidah, Malach Oyehev Tadoko or Mishpat, the king who loves righteousness and justice. Except for the 10 days of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, what we call the 10 days of repentance, where you say HaMelech HaKodesh, the holy king, and the HaMelech HaMishpat, the king who sits in justice or reveals himself through justice. And in fact, the halacha is that if you forget HaMelech HaKodesh, at the end of the third bracha, and you don't correct yourself straight away, you have to say the whole Midah again. You only have to say the whole Midah again in the case where the omission is so intrinsic, it's so existential that in effect you have not done a prayer, you've not said a prayer that is actually germane to the day. And this validates that Rosh Hashanah is about Malchus. It's subtle, and you really need very, very careful and an insightful approach to the text to detect this. But now you can see it all starts to come out. And it's called the beginning of the year because it's the first month it's the first month of the festival cycle. That's another story. But it's the beginning of something which is effectively a celebration of God's sovereignty. And the sovereignty is so inherent that if you don't mention it, I'm afraid you'll say you'll need it again. Now let's look very quickly at this. Now let's go back to those 10 verses about divine sovereignty. Remember, the Mishnah said that you're supposed to ideally say 10 verses. So, Omer Rebbe Levi, Keneged Asora Hilulim. Why do we say 10? Why 10? They correspond to 10 praises that are mentioned in the book of Psalms. Says the Gemara, Hilulim Tuvahavi. There are lots of Hilulim, lots of praises of God. Hanach Tesivahu, though it's referring to the very last psalm, which we actually include in the Musaf of Rosh Hashanah, Hallelujah, the Sefer Shofar, that Hallelujah, where it says Hallelujah 10 times. Okay, that's the first few. Rav Yosef Omer, Keneged Aseres Hadibros, Shenema Moshe B'Sinai. They correspond to the 10 commandments that were said to Moshe at Sinai. Rabbi Yochanan says, Keneged Asora Moshe B'Hen Nivra Olam. No, they correspond to the 10 statements with which the world were created. Hainihu. What are they? So if you look in the Torah, Vayomer, it says Vayomer, God said this, God said that, God said the other. Vayomer Elokim Yehi Or, and God said, let there be light. Vahi Or, and there was light. And there are 8 other statements. Says the Gemara, the Bereshis Tisha. Hold on. If you count in the Bereshis story, there are only 9 statements that begin with the word Vayomer. So how does it work to say we say 10 verses proclaiming God king, but they're to correspond to the 10, and there are only 9? Answers the Gemara, Bereshis Nami Maimahu. Bereshis, that means the first statement. In the beginning, Bereshis Bara Elokim Eis HaShamayim V'Aretz. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Nami Maimahu. It is also a statement, i.e. it's counted as one of the 10. As the verse says, Bidvar Hashem Shomayim Na'asu. Through the word of the Lord, the heavens were made. Now, this Gemara has a lot in it, and we don't have time or probably the inclination to look at all of it in detail. But what this seems to be saying is that there are 10, if you were, the 10 is a complete number. There are 10 praises. King David finishes off the book of Psalms with this kind of complete, all-encompassing praise, and there are 10. Or there are 10 commandments, which are, as it were, the briefest version of the entire Torah. That's a complete set. Or the 10 statements with which the world was brought into being. There's a sort of, there's a kind of theme here. And the sense, of course, is that proclaiming God sovereign is replaying the moment of creation, replaying the moment of revelation, which come together. But there's something very clever going on here. It looks like at the end, this is a bit of an excuse. Oh, look at that, it's only 9. Oh, we'll find a funny answer. Overrated also fits. What do we do with this? Now, to answer this and to give us an insight, which enables us to segue into the last part, which is about the shofar, we have a brief piece from the Sokotchover Rebbe, the Shem Shmuel, and he mentions another example. He said that there's actually a liturgical poem here, it's not one I'm familiar with, to say that the 10 statements correspond to the 10 trials to which Avram was subjected. So he says, actually they all intend the same thing. The 3 ideas mentioned in this Gemara and this additional 4th one. Hainu, the number 10 represents our ability, our intention to reveal over the entire world the notion of divine sovereignty. This refers to the 10 praises, which has a future focus, and it's the 10 commandments, which were given at Sinai, which, as it were, which illuminate the entire world. And these are the very same ideas replaying the 10 states which the creation was brought into being, as I've just suggested. I'm sure you're pleased to hear this is actually the last page of sources. And this is very much the same, as he says, the 10 trials to which Avram was subjected. Human beings are a world in microcosm, and as it were, we go through the same experiences and challenges as the world in its complete state. So what the Shem Shmuel here is teaching us is that the reason there are 10 of these, and there are 4 different suggestions, the 10 praises of King David, the 10 statements with which the world was created, the 10 commandments and the 10 trials of Avram, all capture the same idea, which is, as it were, various ways in which human beings attempt to proclaim or acknowledge or recognize, reveal, uncover, whatever word you want to use, the sovereignty of the divine over the entire world. And what this means, and I think actually that title shofar should probably have gone there, so let's disregard that. I think it's misprinted. This enables us to do something quite clever. I think I'm just going to paraphrase the Bnei Yissoschel. Bnei Yissoschel was one of the very early Hasidic writers, writing beginning of the 19th century, so we now a little more than 200 years ago. And he makes the following observation. In order for there to be speech, one has to create the means of speech. And that means that when God creates ex nihilo, God creates something from nothing, there is not yet speech. The notion of vayomer, of speaking, requires the building blocks, as it were, of communication, the building blocks of proclaiming the divine, the building blocks for all human communication must first be created, because until they're created ex nihilo, they don't exist. And what the Bnei Yissoschel says is the reason why there are 9 statements at the beginning of the Vayomer and one that says, Bereshis, in the beginning, God created everything first, is because it has to be like this, which means that the 10th statement, which corresponds to Shema Yisrael, because if you look at the 10 verses that we use as part of the Musaf service, the very last one is Shema, perhaps the most familiar one of all. It doesn't mention God as king. It does say Shema. So we know it's proclaiming God king, but it does not mention the word Melech, king. As it were, it takes one right back to the beginning. And when one says that verse, one is, as it were, thinking about, as it were, that moment of creation to which it corresponds. And so the whole thing fits together, that Rosh HaShanah, proclaiming God king, can be derived from the juxtaposition, a careful reading of the verses. And it in turn is, as it were, a system of ideas that plug into various core concepts of understanding our relationship to the world, our identity, our purpose, and ultimately has formulated the way Rosh Hashanah has gradually come to be incorporated in liturgy and music and our expectations of it. And that, as it were, that sort of is an almost inarticulate moment, a moment when we're able to go back to before there were words, before there were letters, before Vayomer could be articulated. There had to be a pre-Vayomer state. In the beginning, God created heaven and the earth. As we said, that's why the 10th statement is Bereshis and doesn't say Vayomer. But that gives us a very interesting, as it were, final moment of this. As I said, that phrase, the shofar, should be there. Here's the Yerushalmi in Tanis, and I think it captures. Rabbi Yaakov de Rumia, Rabbi Yaakov of Rome said, "V'lama token b'koronos." Why do we blow? And sorry, I've mistranslated it. It should say, "Why do we blow with horns?" Not koronos. It's not korbonos. It's that. Sorry, it's koronos. Why do we blow with horns? Loima. As if to say, consider us as though we are lowing like cattle before you. The shofar, which was blown in various occasions, but most prominently on Rosh Hashanah, represents an opportunity for an inarticulate cry. You can't put a mouthpiece on a shofar. You can't blow sounds directly into it. You just have to blow the raw noise that it makes. And it represents, as it were, something very deep within, something which bypasses our ability to speak, something which touches something which is very primordial within and without. And the proclamation of the divine happens through the shofar, because the shofar has the capacity to shake ourselves, to shake our world, and to shake us into thinking of that moment of creation, as it were, when God reigns supreme. And that is how all the ideas fit together, and what shofar is, and Rosh Hashanah and the brachos are really all about. And that plays into our final source, which I'll wind up, and then perhaps if there are any questions. This is actually quite a famous source, and I printed it just in English, because actually we don't have the original Sadiagon. Sadiagon was the greatest of the pre-Maimonidean medieval philosophers. He wrote extensively in Arabic, and he wrote really the greatest early work of Jewish philosophy, Ha'amunah V'Deus. But he offered 10 reasons why the shofar is blown, bearing in mind the Torah offers no reason. We saw the two very brief mentions with no explanation. And Abu Draham, which is a text on davening, liturgy, and halachic practices around prayer, which appears much later, I think it's 13th century, much later, cites Sadiagon, and here it is in English. So he suggests the following: Rosh Hashanah is the birthday of the universe. This is the reason, 10 reasons why the shofar is blown on Rosh Hashanah, on which a new ruler became sovereign over the world. The sound of the shofar is comparable to the horn that blasts when a ruler is crowned. Coronation ceremony. Rosh Hashanah marks the beginning of the 10 days of repentance. The shofar is blown to wake people up to do tshuva, which is how the Rambam explains a shofar. It's an alarm. According to tradition, when the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, blast of the shofar filled the air. Blowing the shofar Rosh Hashanah reminds us of the Torah and our mitzvahs. And now, of course, we understand in a shofar bracha, all the verses are about the revelation, because the revelation and the concept of law and the, as it were, the Seres HaDibros, the commandments, as referencing the creation story, all these ideas now fit together. The sound of a shofar is like the voice of the prophets that rang like a siren warning the people. That's a bit like the second. The sound of the shofar reminds the destruction of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. The shofar made of a ram's horn is symbolic of the ram that Abraham sacrificed at the time of Akedah Yitzhak, the binding of Isaac. The shofar is a reminder then of Abraham's faithfulness and devotion to God. The sound of the shofar calls people to tremble in fear. That's based on the verse. The shofar is a reminder of the final day of judgment, looking ahead, as the last three do. According to tradition, the shofar will be blown when all the Jewish exiles return to the land of Israel. The shofar reminds of this eventual time of redemption. According to tradition, the shofar will be sounded when God revives the dead, the Tchias HaMesim. And so one could deconstruct this more closely, but ultimately they are all about seminal moments in history. The role of the shofar is to proclaim creation, to proclaim revelation, to proclaim the presence of God. It is for the prophets to be used or to be remembered by as they reclaim the message of God for the people. It's about moments of great sacrifice. It's about introspection. It's about thinking ahead to the day of judgment. It's about thinking ahead to redemption and to Chias HaMesim, the revival of the dead. And so the notion that the shofar reaches, as it were, parts of ourselves that are almost always inaccessible. And that dovetails with the idea that we are almost articulating, saying pre-speech ideas with the brachas, all fits together very well. And so as a kind of package of ideas, the identity of Rosh Hashanah perhaps is now a little clearer. I do think that it takes quite a lot of work, as you've seen, to extract from traditional sources what Rosh Hashanah is really about. But it is a majestic idea. And when we saw in that source that it suggests that you proclaim God as king, so that our memory will go before him favorably, and we do that through the medium of the shofar, really inheres. And the rabbis, although of course they've invented the liturgy and teasing them into three separate sections, and the way it's constructed are all, of course, of rabbinical origin, it's not made up. It is entirely thematically related to the way the Torah presents these ideas. And it seems fairly obvious, certainly from the final Gemara we saw on the third page, that the rabbis saw the sovereignty of Rosh Hashanah, the majesty of Rosh Hashanah, and the function of the shofar all lying in that curious juxtaposition between leaving the fields, the corners of the field to the poor, the proclamation of Ani Hashem Elokeichem, and the Lord your God, and Rosh Hashanah, what we now call Rosh Hashanah, that follows in the text. So there you go, kind of a bit of a package of ideas about how Rosh Hashanah looks, a kind in the rabbinic literature, but more the sort of thing I'm interested in, which is, well, where did they get all this from? And that's an attempt to sort of, I think, piece it together. So I promise it wouldn't be too long. If there are any questions, you will need to take yourself off mute. I can take a couple of questions and then I can let you go to the rest of your evening.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Belofsky. That was really interesting. I just want to check then, though, where does then the sit in with the
speaking? Sorry, because I can't see everything on the screen at once.
It's Tally. It's Tally.
Oh, hi, Tally. Hi.
Hi, I haven't put on my camera. So with this, it's difficult, well, more difficult to see how this then sits with the days of tshuva.
Well, unfortunately, that's not the subject of the share.
Oh, right. Is that the subject of the next show?
No, because the next one's about Yom Kippur in 2 weeks' time. But I think that just to give a very, very brief answer to that question, I think that that the processes of self-correction have to come into a context. You know, if I was setting up a calendar, you have a new year, you might have the day when you reevaluate your deeds, kind of erase the past and start again the day before Rosh Hashanah rather than a week later. But if the purpose is first to see your place in the world, to understand your relationship with God, with other, and so on, and then, as it were, that to see your actions, the positive and the negative in that context, you need, I think, to first of all acknowledge the divine sovereignty and then go through a process of integrating what that actually means in terms of my own actions before Yom Kippur. So I see there's a natural flow from acknowledgement of God's sovereignty to introspection to then correction. It's an inadequate answer, but it's one sentence at the end of the evening.
Thank you. Thanks.
Anything else?
Rabbi, thanks very much.
Stuart.
As well. One might well be a similar question. You talked a fair bit about where we get the idea of kingship from and where we get the shofar from. I mean, that one's kind of in the text more plainly anyway.
Yes.
The one that seems to be missing is poor remembrance in the middle. Is that the kind of implied as following on directly that because of kingship, we therefore have authority and mitzvot and judgment, and therefore remember us for judgment follows from that? Or is there, as it were, an independent source where that idea is coming from?
No, I think it's the former. I think it follows naturally. And if you look in the Sefer Ikrim of Albo, who's writing, I think, in the 16th century, 15th or 16th century, Albo relates the three sections. The first one, recognizing God effectively is one of the ikarim of there is a God. Once there is a God and the God has a relationship with me, there are certain responsibilities. And then I need to consider those responsibilities, how well I'm doing, and realize that what it means to be in a relationship with God is that God has certain expectations, which from time to time are going to be evaluated. So I think it follows, it's a natural flow. I am going to have to wind up because I have a meeting at 9 o'clock and I have something I need to do in between. And so Thank you for your questions. Thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you all
Rabbi.
soon. Good evening. Good night.